tonight I would like to make the case that the Genesis flood is a local flood that had global consequences. It was local in extent, but it would have been global in effect because it threatened to cut off the line of Messiah and the Genesis chapter 2 works, which God introduced to help reconcile the world with himself. And if those had been blotted out, the world would never be reconciled and the world would go to ruin. And so what was at stake was the whole world, even though the flood was not global. Now, you can't get there by tweaking the view of Genesis held by the rabbis. The rabbis do not believe in Christ. And Jesus said in John 5:46, Moses wrote about him, so much so that if you didn't believe in him, you could not really believe Moses either. And they don't get Moses. It says elsewhere in the New Testament that to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil is over their eyes. So if you take the same view of early Genesis that they take, you are taking the view of someone that the Bible tells you flat out does not get it. They do not understand what the text is talking about. And today's modern, postmodern, critical scholars, even worse. They are blind guides leading the blind. And when the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into a pit. So I want to talk about just Genesis chapter 6, maybe verse 4 of chapter 7, because it kind of fits in just that section where God is describing the extent of the flood. Okay, because there's a lot of things you could say about the origin of Genesis and what is said. Is some of it being said by Shem, Ham, and Japheth, giving their perspective? Is some of it coming from another perspective? But when it's quoting God and it's quoting Yahuwah, then you know that's a statement that's from the ultimate perspective. And so that's what I want to deal with. Can I make the case from the text of Genesis chapter 6, the first part of chapter 7, that the flood was not global in extent, but it would have been global in consequences? And I can, but to get there, you're going to have to assume a couple of things. For the sake of argument, assume that when I say the rabbis haven't got the narrative of early Genesis right, that applies all the way back to the beginning. Even chapter 1, it's pointing to Christ. I've got another video somewhere, 12 places where the original creation account is referring to Christ. And you have to understand it that way to get an answer that makes sense. And the answer does make sense. It makes sense with history, makes sense with geology, makes sense with everything, makes sense with what we know from other cultures. But you have to reinterpret it in the light of Christ. You can't just, I'll keep what the rabbis taught me and just tweak it. You can't get there from here. You have to be willing to take a fresh look at the text. And here is what you would get from a fresh look at the text. Number one, Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 are not the same account restated. Chapter 1 is God in the Trinity, the Father and the Son and the Spirit working together, bringing forth the whole world and all the animals in the world, and people too. Not just Adam and Eve. Adam is a figure of Christ. He's not the sole founder of the human race. And I have other videos about that. But the people that say, well, why did God have to wipe out all the people on earth or all the animals on earth? He didn't. Chapter 2 is not talking about the chapter 1 work. And I'll show you that from the text in a little bit. It's talking about chapter 2. Chapter 2 was something created much later by God the Son. Notice how in chapter 1, God is referred to as Elohim. And then in chapter 2, it's Yahuwah Elohim. He has a personal name now. And the Father is also Yahuwah. It's a family name of God. But here it is used to distinguish the Son, the anthropomorphic form of God who walks in the garden. And he personally formed Adam and Eve and personally formed the animals in the garden in a form, in an actual physical form, when he walked with them. And so it was his special work. What was the purpose of the special work? To help reconcile the larger work of chapter 1 to himself. And you say, but Mark, that violates what the rabbis taught me about initial conditions of the universe. They got that wrong too. They've got it all wrong. You have to look at it as pointing to Jesus to understand it. But if you can entertain the possibility that God the Son is a character in these accounts, then we can proceed. And he is a character. In chapter 6, the unbelieving scholars think, well, this must have been two different creation accounts slapped together, because here they call the supreme deity Elohim, and here they call him Yahuwah. And they say slightly different things to Noah. So that's a sign to us that it's two different accounts slapped together. No, it isn't. It's the God the Father and God the Son. It's two different persons of the Trinity interacting with Noah. The Son is a character. God the Son is a character in the flood account. He is the one who formed Adam. He is the one who formed this special group of animals to help bring civilization and to help move the world to the place where it can be reconciled to God. And he is the one who's very disappointed that it's all turned to rot. And the Father is disappointed too. Okay? But the Father understands the consequences of this work being blotted out. God the Son, in this account, Yahweh is the way most of you pronounce it. Yahweh is saying one thing, and Elohim is saying something slightly different. And that's what I want to look at. I don't want to flip from Scripture to Scripture all around the Old Testament. Let's stick with chapter 6 and the first part of chapter 7 and look at key verses and go deep into the text and see what it's really saying. Is there a more Christ-centered way to look at this text? And if we look at it that way, does what we learn make more sense than what we thought we knew before? Let's start in chapter 6. So let's look at Genesis 6:7. This is the interlinear translation. And again, we need to figure out which character in the count is speaking. Is it Elohim, which I'm saying is God the Father, or Yahuwah, who is God the Son in this account? So said Yahweh, I will destroy Ha-Adam, the man whom I have created. Not all men, not anything, humanity as a whole, but these descendants of Adam, those who were meant to bring the line of Messiah into the world. The promise of the seed from Genesis 3:15. Ha means the, or sometimes of, the men. I will destroy the men whom I have created. And again, I'm saying that is from Genesis 2, not from Genesis 1. And I'll show some more evidence for that in a little bit. But you can kind of tell just by, see the part I have circled in blue there? It's called, it said, I will blot them out from the face of the earth. But the word for earth there is Adama. It's not Eretz, the normal word that means earth. Adama is more like the ground, or notice the name Adam is from Adama. Adama and Adam are related. He was made from the earth. And this isn't necessarily every piece of ground or surface of the earth in the world. It tends to be the cultivated ground, the civilized ground that is used for pasture or for fields. So it is by nature a more local term than saying Eretz. If it says, I'm going to blot him out from the Eretz. And we'll see when Elohim speaks in a few verses later, he does use Eretz, when he's talking about what's going to happen to the world. He uses the broader term. But this is the more limited term, Adama. So I'm saying pay close attention to exactly what the characters say they're going to do. I'm going to blot out what I have made from the Adama. And he says he will destroy several categories of creatures. One of them, besides men, one of them is Behemoth. Do you see that? And the lower corner there, Behemoth, which is translated cattle in Genesis chapter 1. And then the Remez, which is the crawling things, the creeping things. And then the Aup, which is winged creatures, which winged creatures were created on day 5, not day 6, if you recall from Genesis 1. But he is being very specific about what he's wiping out here. The man that he has made from the face of the Adama, and the Behemoth, and the Remus, and the Aup. Now, I want you to keep that in mind. Now we're going to go back to Genesis chapter 1 and see if that fits the list that is made in Genesis chapter 1. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 25. Now, the Aup, the winged creatures, they were created on day 5. So we needn't look for them here. We can just assume that they were a part of the mix because they're created on or made on day 5. But it says, and made God, which is Elohim. So in other words, it's Yahuwah talking in chapter 6, the verse we just saw. But this is Elohim talking, and what I'm saying is that is the Trinity operating together there, where when it says, let us make man in our image, it's speaking plural, whereas in chapter 6, he is not speaking plural, is he? He's saying, I will wipe out the man whom I have made. He's speaking of himself in singular, whereas in chapter 1, it's plural. All right? So the Bible is very Trinitarian. It's Trinitarian from the beginning in chapter 1. And then in chapter 6, you've got the Father and the Son as separate characters in the account. They've just not recognized it as such, because that would require making Christ a character in the account, and the rabbis won't do that, and the unbelieving scholars won't do that. But we need to do it, because that's what Jesus said Moses wrote about. Moses wrote about me, is what Jesus said. But look at these categories. Look at these categories. The Hayat Hayres, the beasts of the earth. Do you remember that category when we were in chapter 6, when he was saying what he was going to blot out? No, it's not in there. The other categories are in there. The Behemoth is in there, Ha-Behemoth, and then the Remes of the earth, of the Adama, that's in there. But what's not in there? What is translated in Genesis chapter 1 is the wild beast. Why? Because he didn't make any in chapter 2. That was a limited set of animals made to help Adam kickstart a domesticated lifestyle. So the list of animals doesn't match up with the list in chapter 1. The pronouns don't match up because God is talking in the plural in chapter 1. Yahuwah is talking singular in chapter 6. And that's what I'm saying. It matches much better with what is he's saying he's going to blot out. He's saying he's going to blot out everything he made in chapter 2. Is that the whole world? No. That is a creation within the creation that he formed for the specific purpose of advancing civilization, preparing the world for Messiah, and producing Messiah and reconciling the world. It's not the same set of animals. And if you go look at this list, the animals are listed several times. The same thing occurs. The wild beasts are not on the list because they weren't a part of the chapter 2 works that God was trying to preserve. You don't have to worry about what about the tigers and the leopards and the wolves and the kangaroos You don't have to worry about those things. Those weren't the kind of beasts that were included on the ark because the flood wasn't global. I've got another video that shows that makes this comparison in detail and shows that God never even said to take every kind of animal on the ark. He just said to take every kind from these categories that were made in chapter 2. Now, let's go back to what God is saying in Genesis chapter 6. We're back on 6:7, and I want to put your attention to one word. It says, I will destroy. It's the word 42:29. Imha. It is Yahweh describing what he will do to the works that he had made in chapter 2. And he's saying he will blot them out. That word there is a kind of word you would use to describe wiping them out in a flood directly. So that's what he's saying he will do. But he's not saying he will do it to the whole earth. He's not saying he will do it to every kind of animal. He lists the kinds of animals there, and guess what? Something's missing. The wild beasts are missing from his list. It doesn't say eretz in verse 7. It says ha'adama. So this is him, the chapter 2 works which he formed to help reconcile the world were instead bringing it to ruin. The chosen people were bringing it to ruin. It was like the story of Frankenstein and his monster. It was bringing destruction on the world and had to be destroyed for the sake of the world, just because they were making the world worse. But the problem was they were also the instrument by which the world was ordained to be reconciled to God. And the Father recognizes this problem. That's what we'll look at next. So let's look at 6:17. And this is Elohim speaking. So this is the Father talking. And he has a somewhat different perspective than the Son does. He is concerned about everything created in chapter 1, the whole world, not just a smaller group in chapter 2. And he recognizes what will it mean if the works in chapter 2 are blotted out in a regional flood. It means the whole world will perish. It means the world will never be redeemed. It means the world will go to ruin. And there's different language in this verse which reflects that. So let's look. See in the top line, I've got it circled in yellow there. It says, I'm bringing a flood of waters on the earth to destroy. Unfortunately, it's the same word used in verse 6:7 in English, but not in Hebrew. Look at the word number. That is not the same word number. That is 7843. It's a different word. And I want to show you the differences in these two words. But the Father here is talking about something different than things getting blotted out in a flood. Okay? He's talking about what will happen if that works of God meant to reconcile the earth to himself do get blotted out. What will that mean for the rest of the world? No Messiah. And notice also the part in blue on the second line. He's saying eretz. He's using the broader word. He's just not just saying Adama, because he knows that even if the flood is local in extent, it will be global in consequences, because the line of Messiah and the works in chapter 2 meant to redeem the world will be cut off. So creation will be cut off from him. And he says, everything in the earth shall die. He uses a word, gava wigwa. 1479 is the Strong's Bible word. This is not the normal word for die. Muth is the normal word for die. This is a word closely associated with that, and it can be translated die, but it's not the normal word. Everything that's in the earth shall perish is a better way to translate it. This word is most often used with the word for die. Many times in Genesis, it's translated, and he gave up the ghost and died. And so when he gave up the ghost is this word. When he died, it's the word muth. So, why is he using a different word here? Because it's describing exactly what I'm describing. He's talking about what will happen to the world if the line of Messiah is removed. And the whole world will perish. The whole world will go to ruin. And that's what this word means. Let's take a look at the definitions of these words. First, let's look at makak, which is abolish. It means to wipe out, to blot out. This is the word that Yahuwah uses to describe what he's going to do to what he has made. It's the word you would use if someone is going to be wiped out in a flood. Now, let's contrast that. This is the word shakhath. This is the word the Father uses when they're both translated destroy in verse 6:7 and verse 6:17. That's unfortunate because they're different Hebrew words and they mean different things. Related, connected, yes, but not the same. And what this word means is perhaps to go to ruin, to be corrupted, to be laid waste. So, to be polluted. So, don't you see that this is a better word to use if the Father is concerned about what will happen to the whole creation if Messiah never comes? The world will go to ruin. And that's how it will perish. That's how it will die. It won't be drowned directly in the waters of the flood. The flood took place only over a small region. But the Messiah, the line of Messiah, and the animals meant to be helpers to him in establishing civilization for the world to help smooth the way for Messiah, that was all going away. It was going to be blotted out. And that would be the consequence unless God intervenes and makes a covenant with Noah. And then those in the covenant can live even if those outside the covenant can die. And that ultimately points to the new covenant of Jesus. And that's another story. But let me show you one more word meaning here. This is the Yigwa Gava that Elohim uses when he describes what will happen to everything on the earth. And again, it's the same idea. It's the same idea as the other word. It's not being blotted out in a flood. It's to expire. It's to perish. It's almost like you are cut off from your source of life. You may pluck a pear, and maybe its biological processes are continuing for a while, but it's been disconnected from its source of life, so it's a goner, even if it's not dead yet. And this is what God the Father is describing. He's describing a world without Messiah, that it's dead even while it lives. Not that they're going to be drowned in the flood that day, but that they won't be redeemed, that the plan of salvation is in jeopardy unless he acts to preserve within that chapter 2 set of works. Let's do one more scripture here, and I'll sort of wrap it up. This is the only verse I want to cover in verse 7, because really in chapter 7, I should say, because what I wanted to do tonight was show you the places where God was talking, that it does not demand a global flood. If you look at it through the lens of Christ, it's suggesting something other than a global flood. The language is suggesting exactly what I'm saying, that the world was created in chapter 1. There was another work later, work within a work, created in chapter 2, whose goal was to bring about civilization, bring about Messiah, and reconcile the rest of that world to God. But this plan is interrupted because the chapter 2 works go bad. Now we're going back to the Son. We're going back to Yahuwah. And notice the language changes again. When he says, I will destroy, it's very consistent. He uses the term that means blot out and wipe out, because he is talking about what he has made, what I have made, not us, not we, like in Genesis chapter 1 where the Trinity is speaking, but just him. And again, he uses Adama, not Eretz, to describe the area that's going to be destroyed, which can be less than the total world. So it utterly fits. It all fits together. Not with the traditional rabbis teaching about Genesis, but one that points to Jesus and points that even this flood story is about preserving the line of Messiah, preserving the works that will lead to Messiah so that the world may be redeemed. It's glorious. It's glorious. Why would any believers want to settle for the rabbi's version of this account when the truth of this account is so much more glorious to Christ? And not only that, as a side note, it has a perfect answer in apologetics terms for all the scoffers and all the people that say, oh, the boat couldn't have been that big, there was no global flood, what isn't God terrible to wipe out, drown everybody in the world, and all that sort of. It answers all of the critics' questions while glorifying Jesus. Why not believe it? Is there some reason other than it wasn't what you were brought up with? Don't let that stop you from following where the Master's leading us. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you.